The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the dusty mercantile, and Helena Prescott's fingers tightened around the torn photograph until the edges cut into her palm. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia to Telluride, Colorado, arriving in the summer of 1882 with nothing but a battered trunk, the clothes on her back, and half of a picture that showed a man's broad shoulders and the left side of what might have been a kind face. The other half, the part that showed his eyes and smile, had been ripped away during a desperate moment when her sister tried to snatch it from her, screaming that Helena was making the biggest mistake of her life. The mountain air hit her lungs sharp and cold despite the June sunshine, so different from the humid summers back east. Helena stepped down from the coach, her traveling dress covered in a fine layer of dust that made the deep green fabric look almost gray. Around her, Telluride bustled with activity. Men in worn denim and leather hauled supplies from wagons. Women in practical calico moved between shops with purpose. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of hammers rang out against metal and the smell of pine and smoke filled the air. "Miss Prescott." A voice called out, and Helena turned to see a young woman approaching, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun. "I'm Dorothy Vaughn. My husband owns the boarding house. Mr. Fletcher asked me to meet you and bring you to his ranch. He had business to attend to this morning but said he would be along shortly." Helena's heart hammered in her chest. This was real. This was happening. She had corresponded with Quinton Fletcher for 6 months, their letters growing longer and more personal as winter turned to spring. He had seemed kind through his words, describing his ranch in the San Juan Mountains, his small herd of cattle, and his hope to build something lasting in this wild territory. When he sent the photograph, she had treasured it, even after her sister's outburst damaged it beyond repair. "Thank you," Helena managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I appreciate your kindness." Dorothy's expression softened slightly. "Come along then. We can wait at my establishment. It is more comfortable than standing in the street, and I have fresh coffee brewing." The boarding house sat at the end of Main Street, a 2-story wooden structure that looked newer than many of the surrounding buildings. Inside, it smelled of beeswax and bread, and Helena felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Dorothy led her to a small sitting room where lace curtains filtered the harsh mountain sunlight into something gentler. "How was your journey?" Dorothy asked as she poured coffee into delicate china cups that seemed out of place in this rough mining town. "Long," Helena admitted. She accepted the cup gratefully, the warmth seeping into her fingers. "I changed trains 3 times, then the final stage from Denver took 4 days. You have come a long way to marry a stranger." It was not quite a question, but Helena heard the curiosity beneath the words. "Mr. Fletcher is not entirely a stranger. We have been writing for half a year. Words on paper can hide much." Dorothy settled into the chair across from her. "Telluride is not Philadelphia, Miss Prescott. Life here is hard. The winters will try your soul, and the isolation can break a woman who is not prepared for it." Helena met her gaze steadily. "I understand that. I would not have come otherwise." Before Dorothy could respond, the front door opened with enough force to rattle the windows. Heavy footsteps crossed the entryway, and then a man appeared in the doorway of the sitting room. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that nearly filled the frame. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and hung past his collar. Several days' worth of stubble covered his jaw, and his clothes were dusty from riding. But it was his eyes that caught Helena's attention, a clear gray that reminded her of storm clouds, and they were filled with an emotion she could not quite name as they fixed on her face. "Miss Prescott," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had imagined, rougher. "I am Quinton Fletcher." Helena stood, her legs suddenly unsteady. She fumbled with the torn photograph, pulling it from her reticule. "Mr. Fletcher, I am pleased to finally meet you." He stepped into the room, removing his hat. His gaze dropped to the photograph in her hands, and something shifted in his expression. "I see the picture suffered some damage." "An accident," Helena said quickly, not wanting to explain her sister's hysterics or the fight that had followed. "But I kept it nonetheless." Quinton moved closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his throat worked as he swallowed. He reached out and gently took the torn photograph from her fingers, studying it for a long moment. "We will make new memories together," he said quietly, and the words struck something deep in Helena's chest, something that had been locked tight since the day she made the decision to leave everything familiar behind. Better memories than a damaged photograph. Helena felt her eyes burn with sudden tears. She blinked them back, not wanting to seem weak or foolish in front of this man who was supposed to become her husband. "I would like that very much." Dorothy cleared her throat. "Will you be married today, then?" Reverend Mills is available this afternoon. Quinton's gaze had not left Helena's face. "If Miss Prescott is willing, I would be honored. But if you need time, if you need to be certain, I will wait." The kindness in his words, the consideration, made Helena's decision easy. She had been so afraid that he would be cruel, that the man in the letters would be different from the man standing before her. But there was something genuine in his storm-gray eyes, something steady. "I am certain," she said. "I did not travel 2,000 miles to hesitate now." A smile tugged at the corner of Quinton's mouth, transforming his serious face into something warm. "Then let us marry this afternoon. Dorothy, would you stand as witness?" "Of course," Dorothy agreed, though her expression remained skeptical. "And I will have Sarah stand as well." "You will need 2 witnesses." The next few hours passed in a blur. Dorothy helped Helena wash the travel dust from her skin and hair, then pressed a blue dress into her hands. "This was my sister's," she explained. "She passed 2 winters ago. I have been saving it, thinking someone might have need of it. You are similar in size." The dress was beautiful, a soft blue wool with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Helena changed carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her dark hair, usually pinned in the severe style favored in Philadelphia, hung in loose waves past her shoulders. Her cheeks were flushed, and her blue eyes looked larger, brighter. "You look lovely," Dorothy said from the doorway. Her earlier skepticism had softened into something almost maternal. "Are you truly ready for this, Miss Prescott?" Helena turned to face her. "I have nothing to go back to. My parents passed when I was 17. I have been living with my sister and her husband for 5 years, and they made it clear they considered me a burden. When I saw Mr. Fletcher's advertisement in the newspaper, it felt like Providence. And if he is not the man you hope, then I will deal with that when it comes," Helena said simply. "But I have a good feeling about him. Perhaps that makes me foolish, but it is the truth." Dorothy nodded slowly. "Very well, come then. It is time." The small church sat on a hill overlooking the town, its white paint still fresh and bright against the backdrop of towering mountains. Quinton waited outside, and Helena's breath caught when she saw him. He had cleaned up, shaved the stubble from his jaw, and changed into clothes that were clearly his best. A dark suit that showed his broad shoulders, a white shirt, and a string tie. His hair was still damp, slicked back from his face. When he saw her approaching, his eyes widened, and he descended the church steps in 3 long strides. "You look beautiful," he said, and there was such genuine wonder in his voice that Helena felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "You look very handsome." Inside, the church was simple but clean. Wooden pews lined either side of a narrow aisle, and late afternoon sunlight streamed through plain glass windows. Reverend Mills was an older man with kind eyes and hands gnarled by arthritis. He smiled when he saw them enter. "Mr. Fletcher tells me we have a wedding to perform," he said. "Come forward, children." Helena and Quinton stood before the altar. Dorothy and a younger woman, Sarah, positioned themselves to the side as witnesses. The ceremony was brief and simple. Reverend Mills spoke about commitment and faith, about building a life together through hardship and joy. Helena heard the words as if from a distance, too aware of Quinton standing beside her, the heat of his body, the sound of his breathing. "Do you, Quinton Fletcher, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Quinton said, his voice clear and firm. "And do you, Helena Prescott, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Helena looked up at Quinton and found him watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I do." "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Fletcher." Quinton's hands came up to frame her face, his palms rough and warm against her skin. He bent slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and then his lips touched hers. The kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, but it sent warmth flooding through Helena's entire body. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with emotion. "Hello, wife," he murmured. "Hello, husband," she replied, and felt a smile break across her face. They signed the marriage certificate, Dorothy and Sarah adding their signatures as witnesses. Outside the church, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "My ranch is about an hour's ride from town," Quinton said as they walked toward where his wagon waited. "I have a horse for you as well, if you prefer to ride rather than take the wagon." Helena glanced at the sturdy mare tied beside a larger gelding. "I can ride, though it has been some years. The wagon might be more comfortable then, especially after your long journey." Quinton helped her up onto the bench seat, his hands steady at her waist. He loaded her trunk into the back, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they left Telluride behind, Helena watched the landscape unfold around them. The mountains rose in every direction, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer season. Pine forests climbed the slopes, and wildflowers dotted the meadows they passed. The road, little more than 2 dirt tracks, wound along a creek that rushed and tumbled over rocks. "It is beautiful," Helena said softly. Quinton glanced at her. "It is wild, sometimes harsh, but yes, beautiful. I grew up in Missouri, came west after my father died. That was 7 years ago. I worked for other ranchers, saved every penny, and finally bought my own land 3 years back." "Do you have other family, a brother in Kansas?" "We write occasionally, but we were never close." Quinton guided the horses around a bend in the road. "What about you? You mentioned a sister in your letters." Helena's hands tightened in her lap. "Margaret, she is 10 years older than me. After our parents died, she and her husband took me in, but they never let me forget it was charity. Her husband made it clear I was a burden, another mouth to feed. When I turned 23 last winter, Margaret said it was past time I found a husband and stopped living off their generosity." "You are 23. Yes. Is that a problem?" "No," Quinton said quickly. "I am 27. I only wondered because your letters never mentioned your age directly and I did not want to pry." They fell into silence again, but it felt comfortable rather than awkward. Helena studied Quinton from the corner of her eye, taking in details she had not noticed earlier. The way he held the reins with easy confidence, The way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert to every movement and sound. The way a small muscle in his jaw tightened when the wagon hit a particularly rough patch of road. "How much farther?" she asked as the sun touched the mountain peaks. "Just around this next bend." The ranch appeared gradually, first the fencing, then a small barn, and finally the house itself. It was larger than Helena had expected, a solid log structure with a covered porch that ran the length of the front. Smoke rose from the chimney, and as they approached, the front door opened. A boy of perhaps 15 stepped out, wiping his hands on his pants. "Quinton, you are back," the boy called. "I got the stew going like you asked and made sure the spare room was ready." He stopped when he noticed Helena, his eyes widening. "Thomas, this is my wife, Helena," Quinton said as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "Helena, this is Thomas Grant. His father worked for me until he passed last year. Thomas has been helping me run the ranch since." "Madam," Thomas said, ducking his head shyly, "it is nice to meet you." "And you," Helena replied warmly. "Thank you for preparing things." Quinton climbed down and came around to help Helena. His hands circled her waist again, and he lifted her down easily. For a moment they stood close, her hands on his shoulders, his on her waist, and Helena saw something flicker in his eyes before he stepped back. "Let me show you inside," he said. The house was simple but well maintained. The main room held a large fireplace, a table with chairs, and several comfortable-looking chairs arranged near the hearth. A kitchen area occupied one corner and 2 doors led off to other rooms. Everything was clean, the floors swept, the windows clear. "The bedroom is through there," Quinton said, gesturing to one door. "And Thomas has the other room. I thought, well, I hoped you would not mind sharing, but if you need your own space for now, I can sleep out here." Helena understood what he was asking, and her stomach tightened with nervousness. But she had married this man, and she was determined to be a proper wife. "We are married," she said quietly. "I do not expect you to sleep on the floor of your own home." Relief and something warmer flashed across Quinton's face. "Thank you." Thomas served the stew, which was surprisingly good, and they ate together at the table. The boy chattered about the ranch, the cattle, the new calf that had been born the previous week. Helena listened, asking questions, and slowly began to understand the scope of what she had stepped into. This was not a grand ranch by any measure. Quinton had perhaps 50 head of cattle, a few horses, and chickens that Thomas had managed to keep alive despite his admitted lack of experience with poultry. But it was theirs, and there was pride in Quinton's voice when he talked about his plans for the future. After dinner, Thomas excused himself to his room, and Helena found herself alone with her husband for the first time since the wedding. Quinton stood by the fireplace, one hand braced against the mantel, staring into the flames. "I want you to know," he said without turning, "that I will never force you into anything. I know this situation is unusual. We are strangers who just promised our lives to each other. But I meant what I said earlier. We will make new memories together. Good memories." Helena crossed the room slowly until she stood beside him. Up close, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was tight. "I am nervous," she admitted, "but I am also hopeful. You have been kind to me, Quinton, kinder than I expected." He turned to look at her then, and the firelight cast shadows across his face. "You left everything you knew to come here. That took courage. I want to be worthy of that courage." "Then be yourself," Helena said softly. "That is all I ask." Quinton reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "You really are beautiful, Helena. When I saw you step down from that stagecoach today, I could barely believe you were real." Her breath caught. "I felt the same when I saw you. Even with the torn photograph." A hint of humor entered his voice. especially then. The photograph showed me your shoulders and the shape of your jaw, but it did not show me your eyes or your smile. I am glad the picture was damaged now, because meeting you today, seeing you whole and real, was so much better than any photograph could be. Something shifted in the air between them. Quinton's hand moved from her cheek to cup the back of her neck, his thumb brushing along her jawline. "May I kiss you again?" he asked, his voice rough. "Please," Helena whispered. This kiss was different from the one in the church. This was deeper, hungrier. Quinton's other arm came around her waist, pulling her against the solid warmth of his body. Helena's hands found their way to his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Helena," Quinton murmured against her hair, "I have waited so long for this. For you." "I am here," she replied, tilting her face up to his. "I am yours." He kissed her again and again, each one longer than the last. When he finally swept her up in his arms and carried her toward the bedroom, Helena did not protest. She wrapped her arms around his neck and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this wild gamble would turn into something wonderful. The bedroom was dark except for the moonlight streaming through the window. Quinton set her down gently beside the bed and lit a lamp, the soft glow illuminating a simply furnished room. A large bed dominated the space, covered with what looked like a handmade quilt. A dresser stood against one wall, and a washstand occupied the corner. "I know it is not fancy," Quinton said, suddenly sounding uncertain, "but it is clean, and the bed is comfortable." Helena turned to him and began unbuttoning the blue dress Dorothy had lent her. "It is perfect," she said, her fingers steady despite her racing heart. "Everything about today has been perfect." Quinton's eyes darkened as he watched her. He moved closer, his hands replacing hers on the buttons. "Let me help you." What followed was tender and sweet and utterly overwhelming. Quinton was patient, taking his time, making sure she was comfortable even as his own need was clearly evident. Helena had been given only vague warnings about the marriage bed from her sister, dire predictions of pain and duty. But with Quinton, it was nothing like that. He touched her like she was precious, kissed her until she forgot to be nervous, and when they finally came together, it felt right in a way Helena had not expected. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, Quinton's arm around her waist, Helena's head on his chest. She could hear his heart still racing, feel the rise and fall of his breathing. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "More than all right," Helena replied honestly. "I did not know it could be like that." She felt him smile against her hair. "Neither did I, to be truthful. I have been with women before, but never like this, never with someone who was truly mine." Helena lifted her head to look at him. "I am yours, if you want to be." His gray eyes were serious now. "I know we barely know each other, Helena. I know this all happened fast, but I feel something with you, something I have never felt before. I want to build a life with you, a real life, not just a marriage of convenience." Helena's throat tightened with emotion. "I want that too," she whispered. "I want all of it." Quinton pulled her back down against his chest, his arms tightening around her. "Then we will have it. I promise you that." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Helena's last thought before sleep claimed her was that maybe torn photographs and desperate gambles could lead to happy endings after all. Morning came too early, announced by a rooster's crow and the sound of Thomas moving around in the other room. Helena woke to find herself alone in the bed, though she could hear voices outside. She dressed quickly in one of her own dresses, a practical brown calico that was appropriate for ranch work, and braided her hair. In the main room, she found Quinton and Thomas at the table, discussing the day's work over coffee and biscuits. Both men stood when she entered. "Good morning," Quinton said, his eyes warm as they took her in. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well," Helena replied, feeling heat rise to her cheeks as she remembered why she had slept so soundly. "What can I do to help this morning?" "You just got here," Thomas protested. "You should rest." Helena shook her head. "I am not afraid of work. Tell me what needs doing." Quinton studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Thomas and I need to ride out to check the north pasture. There are signs of a predator, possibly a mountain lion, and we need to make sure the cattle are safe. You could tend to the chickens if you are willing. They need feeding and the eggs need collecting." "I can do that," Helena agreed. After breakfast, the men saddled their horses and rode out. Helena found the chicken coop behind the barn, a sturdy structure that showed signs of recent repair. The chickens were surprisingly friendly, clustering around her feet as she scattered feed. She found nearly 24 eggs in the nesting boxes and carefully placed them in a basket. With that task complete, Helena explored the rest of the ranch. The barn housed 3 horses, including the mare Quinton had mentioned the day before. The animals were all well cared for, their stalls clean and fresh water in their troughs. Beyond the barn, fencing marked out pastures where some of the cattle grazed. In the distance, mountains rose in every direction, their peaks sharp against the brilliant blue sky. It was so different from Philadelphia. There, Helena had spent her days in a narrow townhouse, performing whatever tasks Margaret assigned her, always feeling like an intruder in someone else's home. Here, standing in the sun with the wind in her hair and endless sky overhead, she felt something unfurl in her chest. Freedom, she realized. This was what freedom felt like. She was hanging laundry when Quinton and Thomas returned several hours later. Quinton dismounted and came to her immediately, his expression serious. "We found tracks," he said without preamble. "Definitely a mountain lion, a large one. I moved the cattle to the south pasture, closer to the house. Thomas and I will take turns keeping watch at night for a while." Helena felt a flutter of fear. "Is that dangerous?" "It can be," Quinton admitted, "but mountain lions usually avoid people if they can. It is the cattle we need to worry about. A single lion can take down a calf, even a full-grown cow if it is desperate enough." "What can I do?" Quinton's expression softened. "Stay close to the house after dark. Keep the rifle by the door loaded and ready. Thomas will show you how to shoot it if you do not already know." "I know how to shoot," Helena said, surprising both men. "My father taught me before he died. He believed women should know how to protect themselves." "Your father was a wise man," Quinton said. He reached out and squeezed her hand briefly. "Thank you for taking this seriously. Some women would be hysterical." "Hysterics never solved anything," Helena replied practically. The days fell into a rhythm. Helena woke early and prepared breakfast for the 3 of them. After the men rode out to tend the cattle, she managed the household tasks. There was always something to do: cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, tending the chickens, working in the small vegetable garden that had been somewhat neglected. In the evenings, they ate together, and Thomas would excuse himself to give the newlyweds privacy. Those evenings alone with Quinton became Helena's favorite part of each day. They would sit together by the fire, talking about their lives before they met, sharing stories and dreams. Quinton told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about his mother who died when he was young, about the hard decision to leave everything familiar and head west after his father passed. Helena shared memories of her childhood in Philadelphia, the happiness before her parents died, the loneliness that came after. "You regret it?" Quinton asked one night about 2 weeks after their wedding. They were curled together on one of the large chairs by the fireplace, Helena's head on his shoulder. "Coming here," Marrying a stranger. Helena lifted her head to look at him. Not for a single moment. You regret placing that advertisement, only that I did not do it sooner. He kissed her forehead. You have made this house into a home, Helena. Before you came, it was just a place I slept between work. Now I actually look forward to coming back at the end of the day. I love it here, Helena said honestly. I love the mountains, the sky, the freedom of it all. And I love what we are building together. I love you, Quinton said, and Helena's breath caught. It was the first time either of them had said the words. You do. I know it has only been 2 weeks and maybe it is too soon to feel this way, but yes, I love you, Helena. You are brave and strong and kind, and every day I wake up grateful that you got on that stagecoach and came all the way to Telluride. Helena felt tears prick her eyes. I love you too, she whispered. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you said we would make new memories together. Quinton kissed her then, deep and thorough, and carried her to their bedroom where they made love slowly, tenderly, taking time to explore and learn each other's bodies. Afterwards, Helena lay in his arms and felt a contentment so complete it almost frightened her. She had not believed happiness like this existed, but of course, nothing good lasts forever unchanged. The trouble started in early July. Quinton came home one afternoon with a grim expression, and Helena knew immediately something was wrong. What happened? She asked, setting aside the shirt she had been mending. I was in town getting supplies, Quinton said, sinking into a chair. Ran into Earl Morrison. He owns the big ranch north of here. He made me an offer on my land. An offer, said he wants to expand his operation, and my property would give him access to better water. He offered a fair price, or what he claimed was fair. When I told him I was not interested in selling, he got ugly about it. Helena felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean, ugly? Said this country is no place for a small rancher anymore. Said accidents happen out here, cattle get sick, water sources dry up. He was smiling when he said it, but there was a threat underneath. He threatened you, not directly, but the meaning was clear. Quinton ran a hand through his hair. Earl Morrison is a powerful man around here. He has money and connections. If he wants my land badly enough, he could make trouble. What are we going to do? Quinton looked at her, and something in his expression made Helena's heart clench. We are going to keep doing what we have been doing. This is our land, our home. I will not be run off by threats and intimidation. But if he is dangerous, then we will be careful. Quinton stood and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. I am not going to let anything happen to you, Helena. I promise you that. Helena wanted to believe him, but fear had taken root in her chest. She had heard stories about land disputes in the West, how they could turn violent. The law was stretched thin in these territories, and powerful men often made their own justice. The first incident happened 3 days later. Helena was hanging laundry when she heard gunshots echo across the valley. Her heart in her throat, she ran toward the sound and found Quinton and Thomas racing toward the north pasture. She followed, her skirts hampering her progress. When she reached them, her stomach turned. 3 cattle lay dead, shot through the head. Blood pooled in the grass, and the rest of the herd was scattered, lowing in distress. Who did this? Thomas asked, his young face pale with shock. Quinton's expression was carved from stone. I can guess. Help me move these carcasses away from the others. We will bury them later. They worked in grim silence. Helena helped as much as she could, though the sight of the dead animals made her feel ill. When they finally returned to the house, Quinton went immediately to the small desk where he kept his papers and began writing. What are you doing? Helena asked. Writing to the territorial marshal in Denver. This is murder of livestock, and it is a crime. I want it on record. The response came 2 weeks later. The marshal expressed sympathy but explained that without witnesses or proof of who committed the crime, there was little he could do. He suggested Quinton hire men to patrol his property, which they all knew was advice he could not afford to follow. More incidents followed. A section of fence was cut, allowing cattle to wander onto Morrison's land, where he then claimed them as his own under the open-range laws. The well near the barn was fouled with something that made the water undrinkable for 3 days until it cleared. Someone took shots at Quinton while he was checking the south pasture, bullets close enough that he heard them whistle past his head. Through it all, Quinton refused to back down. But Helena could see the toll it was taking. He slept less, ate less, spent more time patrolling the property with his rifle across his saddle. Thomas grew quieter, his boyish enthusiasm dimmed by the constant tension. Helena did what she could. She made sure Quinton ate proper meals. She kept the house warm and comfortable, a sanctuary from the troubles outside. At night, she held him close and whispered reassurances, even as her own fear grew. Then came the night that changed everything. Helena woke to the smell of smoke. For a confused moment, she thought someone had left the fireplace burning too hot, but then she heard shouting. Quinton was already out of bed, pulling on his pants. "Stay here," he ordered, grabbing his rifle, but Helena did not stay. She dressed quickly and ran outside to find the barn engulfed in flames. Orange and red light painted the night sky, and the terrified screams of the horses inside cut through her like knives. "The horses!" she screamed. "Quinton, the horses!" Quinton and Thomas were already running toward the barn. Without thinking, Helena followed. The heat was intense, singeing her eyebrows even from several feet away. Quinton kicked open the barn door and plunged into the smoke. Thomas was right behind him. Helena's heart stopped. She could not see them, could barely hear anything over the roar of the flames. Seconds stretched into eternities. Then Thomas emerged, leading 2 of the horses, their eyes rolling white with fear. He handed the reins to Helena and plunged back in. Finally, Quinton appeared with the 3rd horse and Thomas was with him. Both men were coughing, their faces black with soot. They moved the horses away from the barn and could only stand and watch as the structure burned to the ground. "It was set," Quinton said hoarsely. "I could smell the kerosene." Helena felt something inside her break and reform into something harder. She had been willing to endure the fear, the uncertainty, because she believed right would prevail. But watching her husband risk his life, watching everything he had built burn, made her realize that sometimes right was not enough. Sometimes you had to fight back. "We need to leave," Thomas said quietly. "This is not going to stop. Morrison wants your land, and he will keep escalating until he gets it or until someone gets killed." "I will not run," Quinton said, but there was defeat in his voice that Helena had never heard before. "It is not running," Helena said firmly. "It is choosing to live. Thomas is right." "What good is this land if we die trying to keep it?" Quinton looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his gray eyes. "This is everything I worked for, everything I built." "And it can be built again somewhere else," Helena insisted. She reached for his hand, squeezing tight. "You told me we would make new memories together. We can make them anywhere, Quinton, but I need you alive to make them with." She saw the war playing out across his face, pride battling with pragmatism, stubbornness fighting against love. Finally, his shoulders slumped. "All right," he said quietly. "We will go." The next days were a flurry of activity. Quinton sold what cattle remained to a rancher from a neighboring county, taking far less than they were worth but needing the cash quickly. They packed what belongings they could fit in the wagon. Thomas decided to stay in Telluride, having been offered a job at the livery stable. "You sure about this?" Quinton asked the boy on their last night in the house. I am sure, Thomas said. This is my home now. Besides, you two need to start fresh, just the two of you. The morning they left was gray and cool, threatening rain. Helena took one last look at the house that had been her home for barely 2 months, the place where she had fallen in love, and discovered what happiness felt like. Then she climbed up onto the wagon beside Quinton and did not look back. They traveled west, then north, following the recommendations of a land agent Quinton had consulted in Telluride. They were heading for Montana territory, where land was still available, and where, hopefully, they could start over far from Earl Morrison's reach. The journey took 3 weeks. They traveled slowly, camping beside streams, sometimes staying in rough towns along the way. It was hard travel, exhausting and sometimes frightening. But it was also oddly freeing. Stripped down to just the two of them, a wagon, 3 horses, and whatever belongings they could carry, Helena felt the weight of the past months lift one night. Camped beside a river with the stars bright overhead, Helena lay in Quinton's arms and said, "I am not sorry." Sorry for what? For any of it, even losing the ranch, even running, because all of it brought us here together. Quinton was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," he said finally. "I am sorry I could not protect you better. I am sorry I lost everything you came west to share with me." Helena pushed herself up on one elbow to look at him. "You did not lose everything. You still have me. We still have each other. Everything else we can rebuild. You truly believe that?" "I do." She kissed him softly. "I have never been more certain of anything." They arrived in Montana territory in late August. The land agent had directed them to an area northwest of Billings, where a railroad was being planned and new towns were springing up. They settled temporarily in a small town called Meadowlark, consisting of perhaps 20 buildings and a population of less than 200. Quinton found work quickly, hiring on with a freight company that hauled supplies between Billings and the smaller settlements. It was hard work but honest, and it brought in steady money. Helena took in laundry and sewing, her reputation for fine needlework spreading quickly through the small community. They lived in a tiny room above the general store, barely large enough for a bed and their trunk. It was nothing like the ranch house in Colorado, but Helena did not care. They were together, they were safe, and slowly they were building a new life. Months passed. As fall turned to winter, Quinton saved every penny he could. Helena did the same, and gradually their nest egg grew. They talked late into the night about their plans, about finding land again, about building not just a ranch but a real home. It was during one of these conversations, in February of 1883, that Helena realized something. She had missed her monthly courses twice now, and her body felt different in subtle ways. Her breasts were tender, and certain smells made her nauseous. "Quinton," she said carefully, "I think I might be with child." Quinton went very still. "You think?" "I am nearly certain." Helena placed a hand on her still flat stomach. "I did not want to say anything until I was sure, but yes, I believe we are going to have a baby." Quinton's face transformed. Joy, wonder, and a fierce protectiveness all flashed across his features. He pulled her into his arms carefully, as if she had suddenly become fragile. "A baby," he breathed. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Helena asked, sudden doubt creeping in. A baby would change everything, make their situation even more difficult. "Happy," Quinton laughed, the sound full of emotion. "Helena, I am more than happy. I am overwhelmed, terrified, grateful, all of it at once." "Me too," Helena admitted. "But mostly grateful. This baby is our future, Quinton. Our new beginning." News of Helena's pregnancy motivated Quinton even more. He took extra jobs when he could, working himself nearly to exhaustion. By March, they had saved enough for a down payment on a piece of land. The property was smaller than the ranch in Colorado, just 20 acres, but it had good water and decent grazing. Most importantly, it was theirs. They moved into a tiny cabin on the property that needed significant repairs. Quinton worked on improvements whenever he was not hauling freight, and Helena helped as much as her growing belly would allow. Neighbors, learning of the young couple trying to make a go of it, pitched in with donated lumber and labor. A barn went up, small but sturdy. Fencing was strung. Quinton bought 6 head of cattle from a rancher selling off part of his herd. It was not the ranch they had lost, not yet. But it was a start. Helena's belly grew through spring and into summer. She was uncomfortable in the heat, her ankles swelling and her back aching, but she was also happier than she could remember being. Quinton was attentive and sweet, constantly worried he was asking too much of her, that she was working too hard. "I am pregnant, not an invalid," she told him repeatedly. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine." But as her due date approached in August, Helena felt the first stirrings of real fear. They were far from any proper doctor. The nearest midwife was in Meadowlark, several miles away. What if something went wrong? Quinton, sensing her growing anxiety, brought home a surprise one evening in late July. A woman in her 50s with capable hands and a kind face appeared at their door. "This is Mrs. Calloway," Quinton said. "She is a midwife, and she has agreed to stay with us until the baby comes." Helena could have cried with relief. Mrs. Calloway moved into the small loft space above the main room and immediately took charge. She checked Helena over with professional efficiency, pronounced everything normal and healthy, and then set about preparing for the birth with calm competence. "You have a good man there," Mrs. Calloway told Helena one afternoon. They were sitting in the shade of the cabin, snapping beans from the garden. "Not many husbands would think to arrange for a midwife to stay nearby like this." "He is the best man I have ever known," Helena said simply. "I risked everything to marry him, and it was the best decision I ever made." "You were a mail-order bride then?" "Yes. I came to Colorado from Philadelphia, married Quinton the same day we met. Everyone thought I was crazy." Mrs. Calloway smiled. "And were you?" Helena thought about the torn photograph she had carried across half the country, about stepping off that stagecoach into an unknown future. "Maybe a little, but sometimes crazy is exactly what you need to be." Labor began in the early morning hours of August 15th. Helena woke to cramping pain that quickly intensified. Mrs. Calloway was immediately alert, helping Helena into the bed they had prepared, sending Quinton to boil water. The labor was long and hard. Hours blurred together, pain and effort and Mrs. Calloway's steady voice coaching her through each contraction. Quinton stayed close, holding her hand, wiping her face with a cool cloth. Somewhere in the haze of pain, Helena was grateful for his presence, for his strength. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting their small cabin in golden light, the baby arrived. A boy, healthy and squalling, with a full head of dark hair and his father's gray eyes. "A son," Mrs. Calloway announced, placing the cleaned and wrapped infant in Helena's arms. "A fine, strong son." Helena looked down at the tiny face, barely able to comprehend that this person had been inside her, that she and Quinton had created this life. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she touched the impossibly small fingers, the delicate nose. Quinton knelt beside the bed, his own eyes wet as he stared at their son with wonder. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Helena, he is absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Helena asked. They had discussed names but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son, Quinton said, "What about James? After your father?" More tears fell. Helena's father had died when she was 17, and she still missed him terribly. The thought of honoring his memory through their son filled her with emotion too deep for words. "James," she agreed. "James Fletcher, it is perfect." Little James was not an easy baby. He cried often, especially in the early weeks, and sleep became a distant memory for both Helena and Quinton. But every smile, every small milestone filled them with fierce love and pride. Quinton was a devoted father, taking James in the evenings so Helena could rest, walking the floor with the fussy infant in his arms, singing old songs his own mother had taught him. Watching Quinton with their son, Helena felt her heart expand until she thought it might burst. This man, who had been a stranger just over a year ago, was now her entire world. He was her husband, her partner, the father of her child. They had lost so much and traveled so far, but they had found something precious in the process. They had found each other. The years that followed were not easy. Ranching was hard work and money was always tight. But slowly, steadily, their small ranch grew. Quinton added more cattle. They bought chickens and pigs. Helena planted a larger garden each year, learning which crops thrived in Montana's short growing season. They made friends among their neighbors, people who became like family. James grew into a sturdy toddler, then a rambunctious little boy. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and a personality all his own. He loved the animals, especially the horses, and followed Quinton everywhere he could. When James was 3 years old, Helena found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, maybe because she knew what to expect, maybe because life itself was easier now. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Mrs. Calloway, who had stayed such a dear friend, arrived on a cool October morning in 1886. Sarah was an easier baby than James had been, content to watch the world with solemn blue eyes that reminded Helena of her own mother. With 2 children now, the cabin felt cramped, so Quinton began building an addition. With help from neighbors, they added 2 bedrooms and expanded the main living space. More years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growing children. James started school in Meadowlark, riding a pony the 3 miles each way. Sarah proved to have a gift for animals, able to calm even the most fractious horse with her gentle touch. In 1889, when James was 6 and Sarah 3, Helena had a third baby, another boy they named Thomas after the young man who had helped them in Colorado. They had stayed in touch with Thomas through letters, learning he had eventually married and started a family of his own in Telluride. By 1892, 10 years after Helena had stepped off that stagecoach in Colorado, their ranch had grown into a thriving operation. They had over 100 head of cattle now, good horses, and a reputation for quality stock. The railroad had finally come through, and Meadowlark had grown into a proper town with a school, a church, and several stores. But the real treasure, the thing that made all the hard work worthwhile, was the family they had built. Helena would often pause in her work to watch Quinton with their children, teaching James how to rope cattle, showing Sarah how to birth a calf, carrying little Thomas on his shoulders. Those moments filled her with such contentment that she sometimes had to blink back tears. One evening in late summer, after the children were in bed, Helena and Quinton sat together on the porch they had built onto the front of the house. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Quinton's arm was around Helena's shoulders and her head rested against his chest. "You remember the day we met?" Helena asked quietly. "Every detail," Quinton replied. "You were so beautiful standing there in the street, clutching that torn photograph like it was the most precious thing in the world." "I was terrified," Helena admitted. "I had traveled so far to marry a stranger and I kept thinking I had made a terrible mistake. And now." Helena lifted her head to look at him. After 10 years together, his face was as familiar to her as her own. The lines around his eyes had deepened. There was gray starting at his temples, but he was still the man who had looked at her damaged photograph and promised they would make new memories together. "Now I know it was the best decision I ever made," she said. "We lost the ranch in Colorado, we had to run from our home, we started over with almost nothing. But through all of it, we had each other. And we built something wonderful here, Quinton. Not just this ranch, but our family, our life together." "I love you," Quinton said, the same words he had spoken 10 years ago but weighted now with a decade of shared experiences. "I loved you that first day, and I love you more with every passing year." "I love you too," Helena replied. "So much that sometimes it frightens me." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead. From inside the house came the sound of one of the children stirring, then settling back to sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the cattle lowed softly in their pasture. This was home, Helena thought. Not the house, though she loved every board and nail of it. Not the land, though they had worked so hard to make it prosper. Home was this man beside her, the children sleeping inside, the life they had built from nothing but hope and determination. "You ever think about Colorado?" Quinton asked. "About what we lost there?" Helena considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but mostly I am grateful for it. Grateful. If things had not happened the way they did, we might have stayed small, stayed isolated. We would never have come here, never met all the wonderful people who helped us. Our children would have grown up differently, and maybe we would not appreciate what we have now as much if we had not lost everything once and had to rebuild." Quinton was quiet for a moment, then he chuckled softly. "You are wiser than I am, Helena Fletcher. No, just practical. You taught me that. You taught me that what matters is not what you have, but who you have it with." As if on cue, the sound of small footsteps came from inside. A moment later, Thomas appeared in the doorway, his dark hair sticking up and his eyes heavy with sleep. "Mama," he said plaintively, "I had a bad dream." Helena stood and went to him, scooping him into her arms even though at 3 years old he was getting heavy. "Come here, sweetheart. Let us get you back to bed." Quinton followed them inside, and together they tucked Thomas back into the bed he shared with James. Sarah was asleep in the smaller bed against the opposite wall, one hand curled beneath her cheek. They stood for a moment, watching their 3 children sleep, and Helena felt Quinton's hand find hers in the darkness. This was everything she had dreamed of when she stepped off that stagecoach 10 years ago. This was why she had risked everything, left everything she knew to marry a stranger in a wild land. Not for the ranch or the adventure or the escape from her sister's house, but for this. For love, for family, for a life lived fully and well. The years continued to pass as they always do. The children grew taller, smarter, more independent. James developed his father's love of horses and his mother's practical nature. Sarah's gift with animals only grew stronger, and by the time she was 10, people were bringing their sick or injured livestock to her for treatment. Thomas proved to be the scholar of the family, always with his nose in a book, dreaming of becoming a teacher. Quinton and Helena grew older together, their love deepening with each shared sunrise and sunset. There were hard times, of course. Winters when the snow came early and stayed late, when they worried about whether they had stored enough feed for the cattle. Summers of drought when the creek ran low and the grass turned brown. Years when cattle prices fell and they had to stretch every penny. But there were far more good times than bad. Christmases with the house full of laughter and the smell of baking. Summer evenings when neighbors would gather for barn dances and potluck dinners. The pride of watching their children excel. Whether it was James winning a roping competition, or Sarah healing a horse everyone else had given up on, or Thomas reading aloud from Shakespeare at the school's yearly program. In 1898, when Helena was 40, they welcomed their fourth and final child, a daughter they named Margaret. It was an act of forgiveness, naming their daughter after Helena's sister. The years and distance had softened Helena's memories of her difficult relationship with Margaret, and she wanted her daughter to carry that name as a symbol of letting go of old hurts. Little Margaret proved to be a perfect blend of all her siblings. She had James's determination, Sarah's gentleness, and Thomas's quick mind. She also had a mischievous streak all her own that kept both her parents on their toes. By the turn of the century, in 1900, the Fletcher Ranch was one of the most successful operations in their part of Montana. James, now 17, was fully capable of running the ranch himself, though he still deferred to Quinton's greater experience. Sarah, at 14, had officially become the area's livestock healer, with people traveling from neighboring counties to seek her help. Thomas, at 11, had already been promised a scholarship to a teaching college in the East, and Margaret, at 2, ruled the entire household with her charm and stubbornness. Helena sometimes could not quite believe this was her life. She would look around at her grown and growing children, at the prosperous ranch they had built, at the community they were part of, and feel overwhelming gratitude. But most of all, she felt grateful for Quinton. He was 55 now, his hair more gray than brown, his face weathered by years of sun and wind. But when he looked at her, his gray eyes still held the same warmth and love they had on their wedding day. He still kissed her good morning and good night, still reached for her hand when they sat together, still made her feel cherished and precious. One day in the spring of 1901, Helena was working in her garden when a fancy carriage pulled up the drive. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands, and watched as an older woman stepped down. It took Helena a moment to recognize her. "Margaret," she breathed. Her sister looked older naturally, but also tired. Lines of worry and disappointment marked her face in ways that had nothing to do with age. She approached slowly, her expensive dress looking out of place on the working ranch. "Hello, Helena," Margaret said quietly. "I hope you do not mind my coming unannounced." Helena's first instinct was anger. This woman had made her feel worthless for years, had grudged every bite of food Helena ate, every space she occupied. But then she looked closer and saw the tears in Margaret's eyes, the way her hands trembled. "What is wrong?" Helena asked, her natural compassion overriding her old resentments. "My husband left me," Margaret said, and her voice broke. "He found someone younger, someone who gave him sons. He divorced me and left me with nothing. I came because I had nowhere else to go, and I hoped that you might forgive me for how terribly I treated you." Helena stood there, facing the sister who had made her life so difficult, and found that she felt not anger but pity. "Come inside," she said. "You must be tired from your journey." They talked for hours. Margaret told her story, years of an unhappy marriage to a cruel man, childlessness that had been seen as her failure, and finally, abandonment. Helena listened and found herself understanding what she had not been able to as a younger woman. Margaret's cruelty had come from her own unhappiness, her own sense of powerlessness in a world that gave women so few choices. When Quinton came in for dinner and found Margaret there, he looked to Helena with questions in his eyes. She nodded slightly, a silent communication they had perfected over nearly 20 years of marriage. "You are welcome here," Quinton told Margaret simply. "Family is family." Margaret stayed. She found her place on the ranch, helping Helena with the younger children, taking over much of the cooking and household management. Slowly, the sisters rebuilt their relationship, not to what it might have been if their parents had lived, but into something real and honest. Years continued their relentless march forward. James married a rancher's daughter from the next county and brought her to live on the Fletcher ranch. They built a small house on the eastern edge of the property, and soon there were grandchildren. Sarah never married, instead dedicating herself to her work with animals, but she seemed content in her chosen path. Thomas went east to college and became a teacher as he had always dreamed, but he came home every summer. Margaret, the youngest, grew into a beautiful young woman with a sharp mind and her father's determination. In 1910, Helena turned 51. It was hard to believe that 28 years had passed since she had stepped off that stagecoach in Telluride. Sometimes it felt like yesterday. Other times, it felt like that frightened young woman had been someone else entirely. Quinton was 63 now, and he had finally begun to slow down. He let James handle more of the ranch work, spending his time instead with his grandchildren, passing on his knowledge and experience. But he and Helena still took their evening walks together, still sat on the porch watching the sunset, still shared a bed and a life so intertwined that Helena could not imagine one without the other. One evening, as they sat in their usual spot with the mountains painted gold by the setting sun, Helena pulled something from her pocket. It was the torn photograph, the one she had carried all the way from Philadelphia, now yellowed and fragile with age. "I found this today," she said, passing it to Quinton. "It was in the bottom of my old trunk." Quinton studied the photograph, this image of his younger self with half the picture missing. "I barely remember the man I was when this was taken," he said softly. "So much has changed." "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Helena asked. "When you saw the photograph was damaged." "I said we would make new memories together." Quinton smiled, the expression lighting his weathered face. "And we did we not? More memories than I ever imagined possible." "The best memories," Helena agreed. She took the photograph back and looked at it one more time, this relic of the frightened girl she had been and the uncertain future she had faced. Then, with deliberate care, she tore it in half again and then again, until it was nothing but pieces. "Helena," Quinton protested. "Why did you do that?" "Because I do not need it anymore," Helena said simply. "I thought I needed this picture to remember why I came here, to remind myself of the leap of faith I took, but I do not need reminders. I have you, our children, our grandchildren, this life we built together. The photograph served its purpose, but that purpose is done." She let the pieces fall from her fingers and the wind caught them, scattering them across the porch and into the yard. Quinton watched them flutter away, then turned back to Helena. "I love you," he said, as he had said countless times over their nearly 3 decades together. But the words never lost their power, never became rote or empty. "I love you too," Helena replied. "More than words can say." They sat together as the sun finished its descent and the first stars appeared. Around them, the ranch they had built continued its evening routines. Cattle settled for the night. Horses moved quietly in their corrals. In the houses scattered across their property, their children and grandchildren ended their own days. Helena leaned her head against Quinton's shoulder and thought about that long-ago day in Telluride when she had clutched a torn photograph and tried to find courage. She thought about all the years that had followed, the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and failures. She thought about the man beside her, who had kept his promise to make new memories, who had given her a life beyond anything she could have imagined. No regrets. Quinton asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. Helena smiled in the darkness. Not a single one. And it was true. Every struggle had been worth it. Every hardship had led to this moment, this life, this love. She had been a mail-order bride who clutched a torn photograph and hoped for the best. She had become a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a woman who had built a life from nothing but faith and determination. The cowboy had promised they would make new memories together. He had kept that promise 1,000 times over, and Helena knew he would continue keeping it for as long as they both lived. That was what love meant, she had learned. Not just the passionate beginning, but the daily choosing of each other, the building of a life one small decision at a time, until suddenly you looked back and saw a legacy. Inside the house, baby cries started, one of the grandchildren waking. Helena started to rise, but Quinton gently pulled her back. "James's wife will tend to the baby," he said. "Stay here with me a moment longer." So Helena stayed, wrapped in her husband's arms, watching the stars multiply overhead. The wind carried the scent of pine and cattle and the good earth they had worked for so many years. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its ancient song. This was home. This was love. This was everything she had crossed a continent to find, and so much more than she had dared to dream. The years that remained to Helena and Quinton were good ones. They saw their youngest daughter, Margaret, marry a teacher from town who shared her love of learning. They welcomed more grandchildren, eventually totaling 11. They celebrated their 30th, then their 40th wedding anniversaries, each milestone a testament to the endurance of the love they had found. Quinton passed first, in the spring of 1918, dying peacefully in his sleep with Helena's hand in his. He was 71, and had lived to see his grandchildren grown and starting families of their own. At his funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives he had touched, and Helena stood surrounded by her children and grandchildren, grieving but also grateful. They had been given so many years together, far more than she had dared hope for on that long-ago day when she traveled west to marry a stranger. Helena lived another 12 years, dying in the summer of 1930 at the age of 71. In those years without Quinton, she was cared for by her children, surrounded always by the family they had created together. Her last words, spoken to Sarah who held her hand, were about Quinton. "Tell your father I am coming," she whispered. "Tell him I am ready to make more memories." She was buried beside Quinton on a hill overlooking the ranch, and on her gravestone, beneath her name and dates, was engraved a simple phrase: "We made new memories together." The Fletcher Ranch continued for generations after, passed down through James's line. The original house was preserved and eventually became a historical landmark, a testament to the pioneers who had built lives in the wild territory of Montana. Tourists would come and hear the story of Helena Prescott, the mail-order bride from Philadelphia who had traveled west with nothing but courage and a torn photograph, and Quinton Fletcher, the cowboy who had promised her new memories and had spent his life keeping that promise. Their love story became legend in that part of Montana, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But at its heart, it was a simple story. Two strangers who took a chance on each other. Two people who built a life from nothing. Two hearts that found in each other everything they had been searching for. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.